Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to put forth a hypothesis about some of the things that I think I see in the osteopathic profession. Keeping in mind that a hypothesis is a set of predictions that attempt to describe and explain how reality is functioning, or at least observable reality is functioning, that can be tested in a way where if it is working that way, you can see it, and if it is not working that way, you can see it. So you're working from the concept of falsifiability, or as I've said at another point, essentially using the concept of faith, the belief that something you cannot currently observe can be observed, right? So you have to also be able to question it. So if it doesn't work that way, you have to be willing to accept that it doesn't work that way. So a little bit of mumbling, a little bit of rambling. The analog that I'd like to look at, and it's something that seems to work well with physical training skills because it's a physical training modality. If you look at martial arts and the transmission of martial arts, a variety of systems from different places to different places, one of the things that you see is that there seems to be times at which the transmission and the stories look a particular way, and then you're able to access another angle or another perspective on it, and you see a little bit more. So there was a period of time when I was younger where, say, traditional martial arts, or the term traditional martial arts, is something that was used in North America for systems that were transmitted often through the history of recent military involvement. So there was a decent amount of martial arts that left Japan specifically in relation to World War II and what happened after World War II and the engagement of America and Japan in a variety of ways. So a lot of martial arts ended up leaving in the 50s and 60s. Prior to that, judo had been, as a martial art, taken relatively worldwide by people who had left the Kodokan, or the original physical institution of judo, which still exists today. I think the building is quite different than it was initially. I think it's a minimum of 8 floors in downtown Tokyo. But the judo itself, as a minor aside, so please excuse the tangent, it goes somewhere. Judo was an attempt at a modernization of old grappling systems, old battlefield grappling systems that would have been termed jiu-jitsu historically during the Meiji Restoration. So when Japan was attempting to modernize, late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of things that were quote-unquote old were looked upon negatively. So Jigoro Kano looked at a bunch of grappling schools, battlefield grappling schools, jiu-jitsu schools, removed the things that you could not train regularly against resistance, and left only those things which you could train regularly against resistance, which was safe for both the person doing it and the person having it done to them. Therefore, the fighters could regularly train in a fairly safe manner against resistance, so they learned how to do these things well. They practiced them, they knew how to do them when somebody wasn't letting them do them. And then that goes and gets transmitted around the world through varying fighting circuits, catch-can wrestling. So you've got some historical details that are required to understand the movement of judo, and then the movement of karate as an example. Karate had gone from essentially China to Okinawa, Okinawa to Japan in very, very specific ways. So there were very specific individuals who had been in teaching positions, and then things sprung from them. So you can point to people. If you look at karate, I think one of the major individuals who taught a bunch of the Okinawans, who then spread to Japan, was Anko Itosu or Itosu Anko. I don't know which order the family name is, so please excuse me for that. But very, very specific choke points of individuals that you can point to, and then their students. So their students would have taken their ideas and adjusted them, or there would have been alterations in their students, and it kind of moves from there. When you look at these systems that are called traditional martial arts, there was a period of time, especially when mixed martial arts started to be easily accessible to the North American public that there was then a discussion about these quote-unquote traditional arts. And also this happened in the 1960s and early 70s through Bruce Lee, because he was trying to pressure test martial arts. So he ended up in a few, at least as the story goes, a few physical altercations where he wasn't happy with how they went. So he started to recognize that he needed to include other ideas. He couldn't just rely on his quote-unquote traditional system. He realized physical conditioning became very important, that grappling became very important because of the way he learned his system in Wing Chun. It was essentially all close quarter striking, the manner in which he learned it. And then he decided he needed grappling, so he looked at judo, he looked at boxing, he looked at fencing a lot for footwork, things of that nature. So he started to bring things together. So come to the saying of take what is useful, discard what is not, make what is left over uniquely your own. But you can start to see choke points of particular individuals that were teaching things, and then it looks a certain way. So you start to pressure test martial arts, and people make the criticism, especially when MMA shows up, mixed martial arts, that the traditional systems are not that useful, that they are stagnant, stuff like that, without knowing that in other locations they are being pressure tested. So if you look at specific martial arts in Japan, they were fighting quite often. They were attempting to evolve them. But then when you look at how the way in which these martial arts spread to North America, it was somewhat stagnant. It wasn't necessarily as practical as far as was observable. Then you get this interesting thing that happens with something like YouTube. You can access now the people who have had what would be considered a clean traditional lineage. So they knew the people who had pressure tested and fought these old systems. So there's these tiny things in them that if you look at them a particular way, they look useless. And then if you hear it from the person who had it transmitted to them from the person who fought a lot, you can start to see that, oh no, the reason they hold their leg that way is to protect their groin. The reason that they're making these movements where their hands are crossing isn't necessarily because it's a block and a strike. It's actually close quarters grappling in a standing position. You start to see that there are things that were misinterpreted, but because they were misinterpreted by the person who's spreading them, then when they move from that teacher to another student, it then kind of cycles, and it is not until you get cleaner into the picture of the traditional unbroken clean lineage that you are able to see, oh, that was a mistake. We were misinterpreting that. We didn't understand it properly. So then you can talk about cultural transmission. It's a process of cultural transmission through the lens of those that were transmitting it, as opposed to understanding it being built from scratch. So a criticism of many traditional martial arts, especially in the West or in North America, is that they rely too much on forms or patterns or kata. Those are what was transmitted in this region, even though most people who traditionally would have done it would say that's a physical training method. It's teaching you things like balance, things like control, things like timing. But it's not what it actually looks like when you fight. It's not the thing, it's a way to train the thing. And then what ends up happening in North America is that it gets heavily focused on, therefore that is the primary transmission of the art. With karate in particular, when it went from Okinawa to Japan, it was put into school systems, or that was the attempt, as far as I understand it. And the primary site of teaching karate in Japan was in universities and large training halls. So if you look at Okinawan karate versus Japanese karate, Okinawan karate, the stances are much narrower and much more upright, whereas the Japanese stances are lower and the movements are bigger. And what I've heard, and I don't know this to be absolutely true, that the rationale there is because in that large training hall in the university setting, that you had to make the moves bigger so that people in the back could see it. So they learned through a quirk of the location and context of training that the movements were supposed to look bigger, but really it was just the attempt to show it to the back of the room. So now you have this cultural piece. We're learning forms, we're learning them in this way, the person's trying to show us, and we're going to copy exactly, we're going to be detail oriented. So then it transmits down the line like that, without the understanding of the one contextual piece of information that we're just trying to show the back of the room. Okay, so some context to set the stage. We talk about choke points of particular individuals. We talk about misunderstood things. It looks like this, so I'm just going to copy the look of it and then We move forward, cultural transmission, those concepts. If you look at osteopathy as a profession, it comes from an individual in Dr. Still who was on his own, working in a particular way, generating things from relative scratch. It's not that he didn't have contact with any other information or any other hands-on systems. He read a lot. He was learning from a lot of different locations and synthesizing, and then experimenting, testing, so building from scratch. If that is the way the first person did it, the first person is likely of the mind that that is the way it has to be done. So you have the early context of Dr. Still being claimed to not like to teach technique. He didn't like to teach specific physical skills to work on specific things. Part of it is likely because he built it from scratch. Part of it is also likely because each case is unique unto itself. And the primary skill set is the identification of an issue and then the ability to test through problem-solving solutions to see what is going to work for that person. He roots it in anatomy, right? So he has this view of how it's supposed to be done. In all likelihood, the fact that he brought on students who had not spent the background time developing the array of skill sets that got him to the place that he got to, they were in a position where they were missing the context and missing the broad array of skill sets. So they were probably more motivated to learn, what do I do when this shows up? What do I do when this shows up? Because there's a lot of uncertainty when you're building anything from scratch or when you're trying to problem solve in a mildly novel way. It's much harder. It takes way more resources. It's a challenging skill. If you are trying to learn from somebody, you are likely hoping that they're going to distill it in a way where they just tell you the answer. Unfortunately, it seems as though for Dr. Still and for osteopathy as a profession and for any healthcare as a profession, the answer isn't this move or this procedure. The answer is you have to figure out what's actually going on and then generate to a large degree from a variety of approaches as bespoke an approach as is possible. So you kind of have to pay attention to the individual. You want to draw the corollary to fighting. Yeah, you have this particular technique, but if you do it this way, the other person can predict it so they can win. So if you're looking at the fight between, say, disorder and like mechanical disorder and practitioner, well, sometimes the mechanical disorder is not going to respond because the practitioner is trying to do a particular move that is not going to do a good job. So anyways, mild analog tangent. Don't worry about that. Dr. Still fundamentally built stuff from scratch. He problem solved heavily on his own with information from a lot of different places. It's not that he wasn't looking at information from other professions. It's that he was synthesizing it in a way that he rooted in anatomy. So his context, the way that he thought it worked, was build from scratch, problem solve, based on individual in front of you, with the foundation of your thought process being standardized anatomy. Students come along. If you're reading through early osteopathic literature, for the most part, the earlier literature essentially said, find what is not working well and work on it in response to the way that you found it. Then you start to see, well, you're probably going to see this condition in this way in this area. That's kind of the way they start to talk about it. So they start to zero you into anatomical areas. I don't know this to be the case, so this is again part of the hypothesis that Dr. Still, in response to the types of questions that people were asking him, probably started to give general patterns of regions so that they could understand. So it's essentially a conversation that's going in both directions. Dr. Still's trying to teach something. I want you to build it from scratch. And then the students are saying, yeah, but what about this condition? What about this? What about that? And then he starts to say, yeah, you'll probably see it in this region. So if you see how he writes his early books, he's basically like anything above the diaphragm, T8 up. If anything below the diaphragm, T8 down, is a general way that he tends to section the body. So he's saying, if you know your anatomy, if there's a condition, the person's providing you some complaint above the diaphragm, go T8 up, and then if it's below the diaphragm, T8 down. He's responding in large part to the variation in segmentation from the spinal cord to the vertebral level. The nerves come out at vertebral level, and we name them as such, but the spinal cord segment is probably much higher than that in adult, because the spinal cord or the conus medullaris is at L2, which means that the S4 nerve root, right, the actual physical root, is probably in the region of L2 in most people, and then it comes down as an orderly series of nerves in the cauda equina to exit at a variety of vertebral levels. So T8 up, T8 down in relation to the diaphragm is primarily responding to that. Also the sympathetic chain ganglia, so he's synthesizing and responding to that. Then you get into research and practice, and he starts talking more clearly about conditions and specific movements that he would do. He's like, you can try this move, you can try that move for this condition, for that condition. Whereas you look at philosophy of osteopathy and philosophy of mechanical principles of osteopathy, and he's talking more philosophically. It's like waxing poetic. If you're an engineer and you know your anatomy, then you know where to go. This reason, that reason, this reason, that reason, this reason, that reason. You do see a shift in some of the things he claims about specific conditions through learning. So he seems very experimental, willing to try things out and willing to adjust his position based on new information. But then again, you run into his students. So he's a major choke point. He is the initial choke point. The initial people that learn from him repeat a lot of the things that he says. Find it, fix it, leave it alone. Nature will kindly take care of the rest. That really doesn't show up until 1910, but there's things approximating it from Dr. Still before that. And it's basically treat what you find, and you're good to go. Then, with some exceptions, so you see the first book written about osteopathy, 1896, Osteopathy Complete, from E.D. Barber, talking about very specific protocols, where it didn't show up a ton that way in other early osteopathic literature, but by 1903, 1905, you start to see more protocols for specific conditions. So far, the one that I haven't seen that for, so I've looked at asthma, tuberculosis, and I'm looking at goiter at the moment, or like there's simple goiter and exophthalmic goiter. Either way, the anatomical location that is consistent with goiters is the clavicle and the upper ribs, and also the cervical vertebrae, almost regardless of author, and what they say essentially is treat what you find. So treat the lesions you find, and we're good to go. So it's less protocol based and it's really stable. Whereas you look at asthma, you look at tuberculosis, and they talk about different areas and different approaches and different protocols. So it starts to change. All of this comes to the ability to synthesize the prediction that as I look through osteopathic history, what I believe I will find, and this is also partially because I'm lightly aware of how osteopathy transmitted around the world. So if you look at England, osteopathy was first brought there by John Martin Littlejohn. So it doesn't mean that John Martin Littlejohn was the only person that brought osteopathic concepts to the UK at any point. It means that he was the first. So he set it up and he sort of started the culture, and it was a little bit more in the way that he saw things. There was a lot of osteopathic practitioners in the UK who actually went to school in America, so they became doctors of osteopathy and came back to the UK. So there's another transmission route there. So you see some different things in UK osteopathic practice. If you look at the continent of Europe, you see, I believe, Magoon, Freiman, a couple others had gone to France, and then a couple other places in continental Europe. So a very small group of people with a very particular view of osteopathy brought it to the continent. But then there was also a lot of people from continental Europe going to the European School of Osteopathy in Maidstone, England. So there's a few routes that come together. And then you get, a little bit after that, the spread of muscle energy, the spread of Jones technique or strain counter strain. So you look at different parts of the world, and you can probably pinpoint specific individuals or very small groups of individuals who had very particular views of the osteopathic profession that may not have lined up with the strict origin of it, but it would have been a diluted lineage based on who they were around. So you can probably trace the choke points and the preferences to point to why people view osteopathy in particular ways in particular locations the way they do. So cultural transmission and individual choke points, or individuals who become choke points for the transmission of that culture, heavily influence the way that osteopathy is thought about, taught about, and practiced, which is not consistently in response to the individual and find it, fix it, leave it alone. There are styles and flavors and procedures that you can find, so you can probably, if you're watching a practitioner, pinpoint who they learned from in many circumstances. Also, you then have a misinterpretation opportunity in copying specific procedures from these individuals who are choke points, from these teachers who have preferential methods that did not explain the context or the rationale behind how they came to it. Either it was taught to them directly or they made it up on their own for a particular set of reasons. So it gets misinterpreted and passed down and passed down and passed down. This is the move, this is the move, this is the move. You can look at specific institutions, and some of them have, no matter where you go in the world, if they have had interactions with another part of the world, you see the same moves in the same order, no matter what. And then they will argue that although it is a routine set of movements, aka a kata or a form, that they're individualizing it to the response of the person. But those movements are the ones that are used in that order because there are physiological rationale for it. But the underlying assumption is that each person's physiology is the same enough, or exactly the same, that if I don't do it in this order, it's not going to work. Well, that assumption, unfortunately, is wrong. It's dismissive. It's inappropriate. But the net point I'm trying to make is that as a prediction, if we poke around well enough, if we gather information well enough, that the way that osteopathy is functioning is going to be based on individuals who were the transmitters of the profession in particular locations first, set the tone of the culture, set the transmission at that point. There will be variation from it, but there's also contextual misinterpretation of copying procedures that does not acknowledge how or why those procedures were built, and they become part of the contextual, or the cultural rather, transmission of the osteopathic profession. So osteopathy has gone through, as a physical skill set, a transmission process very much akin to, or as an analog of, what has happened with martial arts. There seems to be the opportunity, if we look at Dr. Still and the earliest osteopathic practitioners, they may not have been exactly like him in how they were approaching the profession, because they were learning from him as opposed to building simply from scratch. But because the profession was very small at the start, they were more likely to be building things from scratch. Whereas when they start to have students and they start to transmit, the students are probably taking the answers, not the building from scratch approach. So if you learn from the answers to questions that somebody has built and you don't understand why they built them from scratch in the way that they did, or how they would vary it, or why they would vary it, then you're going to transmit the answers. You may not know or be aware enough that when you use those answers or those procedures or those rigid steps, that it's not appropriately responding to the person. You're saying that the person who was awesome, who taught you, did it this way, so it has to be awesome because you got taught that way. So very, very similar to martial arts, there's been a variation in how it's been transmitted because you're learning from answers as opposed to learning from scratch. Osteopathy, at least in its early success, whatever it's worth, however accurate the claims are, is likely because people were building from scratch and paying attention to the patient, as opposed to learning from the answers that somebody built from scratch. It seems as though there is value in learning how to solve problems, novel problems, from scratch with basic fundamental technical skill sets. It seems to then support the approach that I take towards teaching the profession, which is a heuristic-based approach, or a approach based on decision making, heavily reliant on diagnostic. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm on the right track, but my general prediction is that osteopathy is functioning the way it is functioning because of a very small group of individuals who saw it in a very specific way, and people copied their procedures without understanding why. And the people that taught that and transmitted the profession may have done the same thing. They learned from other people's answers and didn't know why. They didn't build anything from scratch. They just repeated. So I think there is likely value in considering that osteopathy as a healthcare profession interacting with people who are presenting with novel problems, that it is most appropriate to respond to the individual in the moment, to build from a basic skill set with the decision-making framework, and then respond and alter based on how the patient responds to the interaction that you choose or the intervention that you choose. That seems to be more important, and it seems to stem from Dr. Still's success being a broad range of skills, including his use of anatomical knowledge, physiological knowledge, but the knowledge from varying systems, taking what was useful, discarding what was not, making what was left over uniquely his own. That process seems to be valuable, and I would suggest that it could be valuable for the profession at large, but right now, especially when you put it into certain regulatory frameworks and certain educational or academic frameworks, there's the desire for repetition of specific details. It does make it easier to test things, it does make it easier to teach things, but it probably isn't the thing that is most important. The thing that's probably most important is harder to observe because it's non-tangible, it's not visible, it's a problem-solving framework. I'm attempting to teach it, and so far the results seem to be decent, or very good, depending on who you ask. So we will keep chugging along, but I just want to put my prediction out there. Prediction trying to be eloquent. Osteopathy was transmitted around the world by very specific individuals who taught very specific approaches or procedures without either having built them from scratch themselves or not properly communicating how and why they built them from scratch, such that those who learn from them continue to repeat the same procedures as opposed to the process of building from scratch. So thank you for listening this long. I appreciate it. Hopefully you learned something. We'll talk again soon.